ready to go, Emma?
Yep, I'm ready.
Great. Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us online. We're here in St. Paul, the University of Minnesota campus. And as a part of the University of Minnesota Extension and Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative webinar, we're really happy that Dr. Alan Eck is here. Alan is now Professor Emeritus with the department and served for a number of years as our department head here in the department and serving the university as well. And we're really happy that he's talking about restoring some forest inventory data that he's taken a look at over the past few years, going back all the way to 1935 or 1936. We'll clarify that in the webinar. But for a few folks, those of you that are online, you should be seeing the full screen now with Alan's slides. You can minimize that. If you go to the blue bar up top, you can select to minimize that, and you'll be able to see the chat area in particular is an area where we encourage you to post questions. So if you're seeing the full screen, you can minimize that and see the chat area. If you have questions for Alan, do relay them and send them to all participants. That way everyone can see the question that you have, and one of us here in St. Paul will relay that question back to Alan. And so other things, encourage you to put the questions in the chat area, and otherwise we'll have Alan get started, then we'll wrap up by about 1 o'clock or so. So Alan, take it away.
Thank you very much, Matt, and it's a pleasure to be here to talk about a project that has been ongoing for about 2 years, but actually goes back many more years, restoring forest inventory records, particularly in this case those from the 1930s, and what we can find from them as well, given that we seem to be interested in things like change, and history then becomes more important. If I just elaborate a bit, I've always been interested in history, and that's evolved through reading world history, European history, Western history, whatever. And it's led me into looking at forests as I've looked at forest change over long time horizons. If you ever see me in a European museum, I'm the guy who's looking at the paintings of, let's say, Napoleon and some enemy battling it out, but I'm not looking at Napoleon. I'm looking at the forest as it was painted several hundred years ago in the background. And I've gotten into looking at landscape paintings going back 4 or 5 centuries, which kind of gives you a view of how society viewed the land around them and how they used it. So there are actually several texts on that as well. And looking at the Lake States Forest Survey, I blundered into some interest in this by accident when Bert Essex, then the director of the North Central Forest Experiment Station, FIA, took me and several others on a short trip out to the Twin Cities Arsenal out on Highway 35 and 694, where they had been storing their forest survey records since whenever. And happened to be a time when those buildings were starting to decay and collapse and were having water problems, whatever. And we went into one building and there were just a room a little bit bigger than this with boxes. Just boxes with labels on them, and some of them not too clear and not very well sealed. And looking around in there for an hour or so, I said, Bert, here's some stuff on the survey back in the 1930s. Take it back to the office, whatever you want to do. And so that's when I began collecting materials on early surveys, particularly in Minnesota. And that led me to find, among other things, the Forest Survey instructions for 1934 to 1937, including the IBM punch cards on which some of that data went. Anyway, that piqued my interest, and I ended up with 7 boxes of materials, which then became the basis for an LCCMR project to restore that data. And I'll tell you a few stories along the way about others who are involved with this. So in terms of a story today, want to talk about the background of the Lake States Forest Survey, the historic data and sources, statewide results looking at 1936 principally and today, and unit results comparing 1936 with FIA inventories. Spend some time on implications of this work in terms of change, in terms of methodology, and finishing with how do we find some more of these data. So the Lake States Forest Survey, which involved Minnesota, was developed beginning with the 1928 McNary-McSweeney Act, early stages of the FIA program. Back then it was just called Forest Survey. And the Forest Service kind of had two areas of work. One was economics and the other was Forest Survey, and they melded together fairly well. They were really thinking about developing society much more so than we would today in terms of conservation thinking, although that was really much of their thinking. They had $8,000, and R.M. Cunningham and Søren Gevorkians were assigned the survey leaders. Their objective was statistically sound measures of forest area, timber volume, and growth. Those are really smart, organized people, and they were very keen to provide information to help society develop and function better. The work commenced in 1933, and it went on to, in terms of wrap-ups, into 37. It was the field work was under the leadership of Ed Lawson, who became Minnesota's state forester years later, and we also have at his generosity a undergraduate scholarship for students in forestry. The survey started in Minnesota, it ended in Tomahawk, Wisconsin, 15,000 miles of survey line, 125,000 plots across. In Minnesota there were 6 survey units, not quite what we have today, but this is out of the manual, the map of how this work progressed. So you're looking at lines horizontally across the landscape by hand, by vehicle, by whatever means, and plots in forested areas of about maybe 8 per mile. And these were plot sizes we'll get into, and 125,000 sample plots, and about then a third of those in Minnesota. So this was a non-trivial effort, a lot of it in the summer, but also some pretty tough winters. So a transect layout, a line, 10 miles between transect lines, if you just dice Minnesota at 10-mile increments, and 1/5 acre plots, and then some subplots within that for smaller materials and special interests. There was a special interest in the 1930s in cedar, and particularly we didn't really have chemicals for wood treatment and longevity, and so cedar was a big deal, and it shows up in much of the work. Kind of based on some Swedish designs, we'd call it a line plot strip. 6 survey units in Minnesota, and in fact a fair amount of data at each plot. We were not able to find the original plots. We were able to find the summaries of those, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And here's our 6 survey units. Unit 6 is much like today, out on the prairie. Unit 1 and 2 are our major units. And the fact that those units then were somewhat different to today, and we don't have really good georeference data, we have it by survey unit, made some of our comparisons and detail difficult, to say the least. So we had the manual. The manual is really a good manual. I mean, every time I look at it, I'm impressed. They didn't necessarily match up with today. They didn't have the background work. There wasn't site index data for forests. It was pretty descriptive in a simple sense. There were memos in there. From now on, you will do this. We have an example here on this page of one of many in there establishing procedure, did a pretty good job initially, but then there were questions, and they came up with changes, and I think much of that experience led to the rather sophisticated manuals we have today. A key report is the summary in 1938, this forest areas and timber volumes in the lake states. That became our basis for checking the recompilation work we did with the original data in the summary form that we were able to obtain. And out of the archive building at the old arsenal came 7 of these books for Minnesota, 6 or 7, Brian? And one for each survey unit. Here's 3. They were about 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet with blueprint type spreadsheets, and all the numbers were filled in by hand from the 30 or 40,000 plots in each state. And that was the data that we were able to work with. They were spreadsheets. We turned them into Excel spreadsheets, and I think there were well over 200 Excel spreadsheets. Brian's going to the eye doctor pretty soon just to deal with the stress of that effort. But Brian and Merrill Flannery did much of that compilation into spreadsheets, which gave us an opportunity then to check the work not only against the original books, as we call them, the stand and stock tables, but also against the 1938 Economics Notes 9 paper. And the 2.5 by 2.5 foot summary sheets looked a lot like this, with trees per acre and volume per tree by species, DBH for each cover type and size class. 190 tables there, about 120 over in the summary areas, and we were able to make this come out fairly well. If you had to summarize it, we had individual tree data and plot data, but again summarized at this big book and survey unit level and then summarized across the state. And you can see they were measuring trees down to an inch in size, and with 4 stand size classes, basically saplings, poles, saw timber, and really large stuff, 4 size classes. They had a sample tree for volume on each plot. We had different ownership groups. We had 20 species and 13 cover types plus 4 non-forest cover types. So in effect, we took that and began comparing the 1936 result with recent inventories. On a lot of our spreadsheet numbers and the Economics Note 9 reports of 1938, we were right on. We were exact. In a few cases, particularly board foot volume, there were conversions in there that were unique, yet we were typically within 1 to 3% on that area. On cubic foot volume, much less problem, but board foot volume involved more interpretation of size and whatever, and 1 to 3%, we were quite happy with that. If we look at then some of the differences between 1936 and today, if we look at area and we have thousands of acres on the y-axis and the 2 years on the x-axis, this is what our forests looked like in 1936. The timber harvesting in Minnesota really got underway post 1865, after the Civil War. We had sawmills in the 1840s, but things really boomed after the Civil War. The peak harvest was in the last few years of the 1890s. I think 1899 was probably the peak harvest, primarily in terms of board feet for the building of the cities of the upper Midwest, Chicago, Twin Cities, Milwaukee, Omaha, whatever. So we had a very large acreage of material in the small tree category, less than 5 inches. Not so much in the medium-sized trees, basically 5 to 9 inches, and then larger trees larger than 11 inches in DVH. Not much left. I mean, what was our plan? It was to build the rest of America, and that was going to take wood. When I asked my daughter to look at her house in South Minneapolis and what do the joists in the basement look like, they're white pine. We built everything with it. So we had a purpose in mind at that time. So it was a very young forest, and then we had this wall of wood moving forward for the next several decades, and this wall basically became bigger or larger in diameter on the average, and that was the wall of wood that people talked about for many decades, this very large acreage of very young material. And today, if we look at our forests, much less small size material. Here's our mature material, and here is our older forest. So we've really increased the older forest, decreased the younger forest, and across the size classes that the survey used. I mean, really just dramatic change. If we looked at this by cover type, we would see even in 1935 or 36, the aspen and birch types, the first pioneer species that were really successful, dominated the cover types. Spruce fir hasn't changed that much since then, if we look at our 3 years. And so this was this wall of wood. And in 2014, it's come down a bit. We still have all of these cover types. We still have all of these species. It may help to look at that from the standpoint of without the aspen birch. Nope, I guess I took that one out. That's Minnesota's forest. Then today, we're adding more oak, particularly in the southern half of the state. Black spruce hasn't changed a great deal. Tamarack is actually up since the 30s. A variety of these things, one can go back and examine perhaps how that happened or what was the interest that made that happen. And so we have a lot in the way of comparisons to make. If we look at the volume that is provided, which is more a measure of how much growing capability these forests occupy, we're seeing a lot of that volume in aspen. 1936 between, so in 36 these aspen were mostly small, not much volume. Today it's much more. And you get a sense that in terms of volume, just most of the forest was pretty young. There have been real increases in how dense the forest is. There's much more material there today than there was in 1936. Looking at some old photographs of my father and uncles hunting in the 30s and 40s for grouse and pheasants. I mean, they have bodies of birds hanging all over their Model Ts and 1936 Ford and 35 Chevy and whatever. And in the background, it's brush. I mean, it really isn't hard to find a photograph that shows real mature forest in any of those old family pictures. If you look at the merchantable volume by hardwoods versus softwood type, in 36, hardwoods and softwoods were fairly close, still fairly close, except we see more hardwood on the landscape today and relative to softwood quite a bit more. So we've had a change in the composition of that forest, and we've seen that over the last 30 years. It's interesting to go back and see what it looked like in the 1930s. That's the volume capability, and if you look at the sum of these two numbers and the sum of those two, you get a sense, going back to that earlier graph, that the volume has really expanded. These forests have come back and filled up the growing space. If we look by the cordwood volume by survey unit for the 6 major pulpwood species, and I wonder if this, don't have it on that figure, Unit 1 is in the northeast, but not the far Arrowhead region. Unit 2 is the central pine region of the state. Unit 3 and 4 are around the Boundary Waters, Lake Superior area, and I suspect back then they had more wood in these two areas simply because we hadn't got to them totally yet in terms of harvesting. And if you look at our prairie units, southern and prairie units, not much by the graph. If we look by ownership, and many are familiar with that, but the area of public ownership has increased quite a bit since those early days. The national forests have grown by picking up additional acreage. The state acreage has grown. County was essentially zero ownership, and today it's several million. And private has come down, and what really happened was this much was tax forfeit and went to provide county and municipal ownership and state ownership in large part. So we bought a lot of starving farm families off the landscape in the 1930s. That showed up then today as our county forest management system. Not that this group wouldn't know that, but I suspect much of the public would not be aware of that historic change. If we look at, and no, that's not a new spelling. That's supposed to read area of non-forest by cover type. I guess I don't have the, well, it is cover types here. So back in the Economics Notes 9 or 10 report in 1938, they talk about 19 million acres of forest. But in fact, quite a bit of it was what we would call brush, and they also call brush. So it's a little bit confusing. If you look back in some records, you'll see them talking about 19 million acres of forest back then. Lot of non-forest. And then what happened by 1977 was that a fair amount of this, a large amount of this brush turned out to be forest, and that anticipation caused them to conclude they had not just 15 million acres of forest back in 1936, but really several million more acres that was going to turn into forest. But it was probably only 10 feet high. If we look at the cover types, and I think I've kind of walked through this one. I'm going to skip that one. And we've looked at conifers and hardwoods and the total acreage back then except for this brush element. We also get some capability to dig into this data that I would try to emphasize in terms of what you can get out of it compared to today. So let's look at a somewhat of a biodiversity related or stocking related comparison of looking at trees per acre by cover type and stand size class. 1936 versus 2014. And for virtually all three size classes, small trees, medium size class, stand size class, and large tree size class. We have fewer trees per acre in 1936 than we have today. Fewer trees per acre of virtually all species. I think that's kind of an interesting thing. These forests had been cleared, they hadn't come back very far, and a lot of this brush was in another category, not considered forest. And if you look today, then we have more trees in every category or every cover type. And a thing to note that the survey points out is that the fact that we have more trees in 2014 in the small size class and even almost in the larger size class, but certainly here, a lot of that was balsam fir. So if you think of really long-term species dynamics and species like balsam fir that can grow up under shade, grow up under quite a bit of competition, then you see why this has really happened. We opened up the forest, the balsam fir responded more than anything, and we have larger tree numbers today. I don't think many people go back that far to contemplate. I've looked at 77 survey versus today, and I haven't really dug in and noticed. It wasn't obvious, but for this period of time, going back to 1936, the forest looked different on the ground as well as higher up. And the work goes on to note that aspen is another reason these numbers tend to be higher today. So if you really look at what we have here, we have for each size classes, small, medium, and large, we have the different cover types and the trees per acre. If you take out balsam fir and aspen, it'll probably come down quite a bit. So all of these cover types had other species in them. And if you look at white pine for an example, and we have some real interest in white pine aesthetically and for the habitat value of it, here we have 3 stand size classes. And if we look at those this composition, we have the large size classes. This is white pine cover type. White pine cover type. What were the species that were comprising the white pine cover type for stands of small size trees? It was mostly white pine. It's pretty obvious. This is a fairly visibly thick grove of white pine coming back. For the medium-sized one, we see more aspen showing up. And interestingly, for the large-size stands that we show as white pine, only a small number of the actual trees, even though they are large, show up as white pine. So this obviously is going to change unless we're able to bring back quite a bit of white pine. It's now turning into something else, and we should talk to the white-tailed deer about that. Now we could look at our stands today or in 77 or whatever and look at similar kinds of comparisons. If we look at the survey unit forest area change, we don't see much that's very dramatic, except probably in the southwestern part of the state. We really are losing much of that forest area. I'm surprised it's even as high as this, given the agricultural efforts in those areas. But Unit 1 and Unit 2, Unit 3, not terribly different, and you have to factor into this, to some extent, the fact that definitions in 36 and definitions today are not quite the same. I think that you have to try to deal with and then end up just kind of wondering a few percent. And if we look at the volume of of cubic foot volume of wood, net cubic foot volume by FIA today, the light green bar versus the dark bar back in 1936, you can see how the volumes of the individual species have virtually all gone up. The peculiar ones are down here where we just don't have many. Red oak, white oak, we don't have so much. And then jack pine has really fallen off in the last several decades just because it doesn't live that long. So what should I say? Another example of these forests are older and thicker than we have become accustomed to. If we look at board feet, that has to be bigger trees. And the board feet, we had about 12 billion in 1936. And again, if you see 1935 or 1934 numbers, they really should say 1936. And we'll fix those. We have almost 3 times as much, or 3.5 times as much, in the way of board feet, which really means larger trees today than we had then. That means we have a lot of biomass out there. We haven't computed the biomass, but if you want a rough number, just multiply by whatever, and you'll move that board foot volume to something approximating biomass. So when we talk about how thick are these forests, they look like they're 3 to 3.5 times thicker, more dense. This is not a forest we have seen in the last 10, 12,000 years. I mean, this is a different critter. Talk about why, fire protection might be one reason. We did have a problem of comparing unit results, and that is we have 4 units today, and we had 6 then, and we had to make some decisions about how to map those two, and there were a couple of problems. At least 2 counties were divided by FIA back in 1936 to make things work easier. And so when we talk about comparisons we made on a unit level, it's a little foggy. Plus, if there was a problem, we wished we could handle a number of our comparisons of trees per acre and things, leave out unit 4. Even back in the 30s, there had to be some cooperation between parts of agencies to get things done. The National Forest System, or the Superior in the Chippewa, be that as it may then, were tasked with providing their data on that unit. They provided everything the survey itself collected in the other units, except they did not provide any trees per acre data. Volume per acre, cubic foot volume, board foot volume, cover type areas, and everything else, but not trees per acre. So these comparisons I talked about in terms of anything trees per acre, you'll see a little footnote down on some of these slides that say excluding 2 million acres of forest in Unit 4. And then Aiken County was one of these counties that was divided between survey units and took a little extra adjustment, so to speak. So here's our new survey units, and all of Aiken County shows up. If we wanted to look more specifically at oak, we could describe that change in the oak cover type from 980,000 acres to 1.5 million now. Much of this big increase really took place in the last 30, 40 years. The 1982 dairy herd buyout in southern Minnesota just turned a lot of, and Wisconsin and Michigan turned hundreds of thousands of acres of wooded pasture, which didn't count in the survey, within 10, 15 years into forest. Lost some of my best turkey hunting land through that dairy herd buyout. And so we get reasons that are not necessarily very much based in ecology, but some other area, like dairy supplies, leading to changes in acres of a particularly interesting cover type. That's one of the biggest ones. There are a few others around that we're going to see show up in various places around potato farming and whatever. Bob Stone, who used to run he ran the survey office for FIA out of St. Paul in the 1960s, told me once that across the U.S. there's about 1 million acres in any one year, wherever they may be, that go back to forest or out of forest into agriculture. That 1 million acres just can happen in a variety of places, North Carolina or Minnesota, whatever. It just happens. And that 1 million acres can be important to your area. So I wanted to touch on a kind of a summary of this. There's lots more things you can do with this data. Have a number of other tables we've developed. The data itself now, plus the manual, and the database description, it's an access database, is on the IIC website, along with sample queries for a number of these tables. And this manual has now been scanned and is available as a document. So all those things describing this data, the manual, the data itself, and how to use it, data description, it, whatever, are on the IIC website. And there's just lots of things one might look at here. So what did we get out of this LCCMR project? We got some methodology for restoring early lake stage forest survey. We have the equivalent large books for Wisconsin and Michigan. It probably cost about $100,000 worth of effort to take one of those states, that data, and go through the same process that Merrill Flannery and Brian went through to probably a little faster this time because we know what we're doing, to bring that up to this level. In fact, I think the Wisconsin, Michigan records we have are a little more complete than we've had for Minnesota. This restored data is most precise at the statewide level because we really didn't have individual plot data and georeferenced information. But we can work around some subjects with unit level results. Just the simple question of any movement or change in the numbers of a particularly minor species. Maybe it's red maple, maybe it's tamarack, maybe it's blue beech. Where does this show up in the survey? And if we go back and look, almost all of those, I can't think of actually a single one that isn't, that was there then and isn't here now. So we can look at species composition and changes and bolster or confuse our findings from more recent data. The data really is, I think, a pretty useful tool for exploring these gross changes. And we can add to it, the data now is fairly reachable. We do have these problems, we can't really develop sampling errors without the original plot data, and even then some variables have definitional problems compared to today. And there weren't site index curves. Wasn't much site evaluation other than upland or lowland back then. And this Unit 4 problem with the missing tree count data, we've scoured the terrain and we just can't find that data. So what are some implications for change in the forest? The forest area has really not shrunk. If you throw in the brush, the forest area is really about the same as it is today. Substantial brushland really did return to forest. Statewide, the stand size class distribution has shifted from a largely young forest to a largely older forest. Tree size, volume, and biomass per acre and overall have increased. Board foot volume is 3 times what it was in 1936. Early successional forest area and associated wildlife habitat taken a major dive. I mean, if you wondered what happened to the pheasant and grouse populations, transport yourself by whatever cool vehicle you have back to 1930s and go grouse hunting, and you'll see there's just brush all over the place. Late successional forest, mature and older stands has increased. The forest growth is slowing. The health and tree quality are declining, and we ordinarily get that with an older forest. Softwood area has declined. The hardwood area has expanded. The oak cover type has increased. Interestingly, forest fuels are now 3 times what they used to be. And as I look at the history of fire in the lake states, we now have the capability to burn a couple 100,000 acres in a few hours. Just pick yourself a place out here in Anoka County and light a match on a dry weekend and see where it goes. We did have a 4,000 acre fire up by Carlos Avery about 10 years back that surprised a lot of people. It happened so fast there was really no way to avoid losing a number of houses. I think we need to look at that. In fact, if you go to UFRO's various studies, they talk about this redevelopment of a fire situation is a common theme in almost all developed countries that have had their forests grow back and thicker, so to speak. So it's not just us, but it is a global thing. So we have a very different forest than we had since glaciation. This forest is, when Zebulon Pike went up the Mississippi in 1803 to 1806, he stopped at a number of places, but I remember one not far from my cabin up in Aiken County on the Mississippi, and he wrote down in his journal, scattered oak and pine and buffalo and elk. I mean, these were more open forests, much more subject to damage. And as we look at what FIA has for disturbance variables nowadays, we can see there's a lot of disturbance out there then, and especially fire. Those forests then were more open. At the same time, public ownership has increased dramatically, largely due to the tax forfeiture of private lands. This is a different situation than we have had in at least centuries. We've got a number of analyses that we'd like to conduct, trying some different ways to deal with the missing tree count data in Unit 1. And as we get a handle on that, looking more at species presence changes, figures, tables, and results. And we might go back and look at the recovery of these brushlands, for instance, by unit, what they have become if we can identify more tightly. A number of things you might get into. And our project really dealt with the restoration. We've been really taxed to find the time beyond that to get into analysis. We do have some plans we're working on for finding more of this historic forest inventory data. And if you're pondering research, I went to the Federal Record Center in Kansas City to find where you just basically drive into a big hill, and underground is about a half square mile of 30, 40 offices, federal and private and scientific and whatever. And it's kind of dark down there, but there are a lot of lights, and actually this door is where you drive in and you come out the other one. This door is easily large enough to accommodate the biggest semi you see on the highway. And when I went inside, there were semis running all over inside. And I got to the Federal Record Center, and they pulled out, as we had pre-identified from local records and just plain searching federal records, Forest Survey records are code 95. And so when I arrived, there were like 60, 70 boxes laid out in a room for me to look at. They don't let you go back in the stacks, but I looked through about 70 boxes systematically in a day and was able to pull out a lot of things. I pulled out 11 boxes that were Kevorkian's life work and notes, including some special studies on aspen. I found records of a survey conducted between 1946 and 1952 that had never really gone anywhere. I mean, the files were there, the records were there, the maps were there, whatever. It's just that FIA never had the time and the chance, the resources to analyze that. There was a nationwide effort to create in the 50s a permanent plot database with something like 50-acre plots, and there were in Minnesota hundreds of these laid out across the state. Nobody ever went back to remeasure them. The original data is still there from the 1950s. Just some real jewels, but we couldn't find the original plot sheets except a few examples for the 1936 survey, and we have yet to be able to find the statewide survey from I think started in late 50s, Mark, probably, and it was been labeled the 62 or the 66 survey. So beginning in the 70s with surveys, FIA was much more organized nationwide, had more resources, and we have fully digitized surveys since then. The earlier ones, having lost them is a common problem nationwide. Brad Smith, who used to work with the Northern Research Station survey, is in Washington with FIA, and in the process, assuming it's successful, developing a archivist position for FIA data and setting up regional efforts to restore that FIA data. Most of it from the 30s and a lot from the 40s is just somewhere in there. If you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, and one of the last scenes is looking through the view of the Federal Record Center and thousands of boxes, whatever, that's where we are. So lots of things might be possible. It's going to take quite a bit more of digging. There are actually 17 record centers like this around the country, and we know the Forest Service has data as at least 5 of them, and I think we're going to see a move to bring those back to the separate survey units to begin to work with them, since they're really so valuable historically as you look at issues like climate change, carbon sequestration, land use, etc. Do I have anything else? Not really much, except, for example, a page out of here. There's just a tremendous amount of material to help you figure a survey out. And with that, I would say thank you very much, and questions.
Yeah, we have several questions from online and maybe some from here in the room as well. A couple of questions about cedar and one about jack pine. Maybe we'll start with jack pine. Jack pine acreage dramatically lower today compared to 1936, and other early successional species like aspen and tamarack have increased. Why the different trends, and should this be concerning?
I think that aspen has always been in the landscape, just not very dominant without the white-tailed deer taking out the white pine, so to speak. So I think if we didn't have the white-tailed deer problem, which is due to a number of things, we'd probably see much more white pine on the landscape. The tamarack I am not so familiar with. I know a lot of people used it in the 30s and 40s to build barns. So it was a heavy local use wood. It has some problems in recent years with sawflies. Jack pine is an interesting one in that it was a major pulpwood and small sawlog species until about the 1960s, when the supply for jack pine began to be viewed as too short. And in the matter of a decade, technological developments in the forest products industry, particularly the paper industry, shifted almost all of our mills from jack pine, of our large mills, from jack pine to aspen. There are 4 million acres of aspen. There was only less than 1 million acres of jack pine, and for lack of use and lack of fire, we've just seen jack pine fall by the wayside. It is not a long life species, and so it's one through a combination of circumstances has gone downhill and is likely to continue unless there is a real reason to use it, which disturbs it. Serotinous cones, seed capabilities are high, but in order to restore it, you really have to disturb it, and over many acres.
Yeah, I'd say with the jack pine also, it's a much greater disturbance to regenerate it than aspen, and a lot of these mixed stands are at jack pine and aspen with a minor or a less intrusive harvest are converted to aspen.
Yes, and the partial harvesting focus in the last, since the early 90s, has really somewhat hurt both aspen and jack pine in terms of their recovery on the landscape. The big question is, how much aspen do you really want on the landscape? But we tend not to ask and answer those questions uniformly.
And another question on cedar. Current northern white cedar volume is surprising given the historical harvesting and lack of regeneration. So what did the data really tell us was happening with cedar?
The data shows a lot of trees in the cedar cover type, but most of them are not cedar. So the larger cedar trees, we've been saving them. They last a long time. We've retained some substantial acreage, still small, but I guess we would say a fair amount of that acreage, but it is increasingly populated by balsam fir, by aspen, whatever, and eventually it's probably going to, the numbers are going to fall.
I think with cedar, we've got a few acres with really high volumes of them. The highest volume per acre plot in Minnesota was cedar. I had to go to it at a basal area of 350.
Yeah, I can believe it. I've seen a few small stands. I haven't seen many that are over 5 or 10 acres, but
yeah, we've got these pockets.
And we have another question about elm, kind of the trends in elm through the years. From the graphs, it looks like it hadn't really changed much.
You know, that's a good question. I haven't really looked at elm. Obviously, elm had some problems beginning in the 70s. There is still elm out there. You run into it. You're just not seeing as many elm stands. And it's one really worth looking at.
Any questions from here in St. Paul?
Well, my pleasure. If anybody wants to go to the cave, let me know. We can arrange a day for you in there. That should probably do you.
Yeah, one thing in looking at these long-term trends we've seen, somebody surprised me was trying to look at like decline in forest around the metro area. You see cycles, and in metrification or urban expansion, often the cycle is agricultural land gets converted to forest land as the value increases for urbanization, and then converted is developed.
Yes.
That was one trend that surprised us.
And then we burn it.
Yeah, then, yeah.
Thank you very much, man.
Great.
One more question.
One more question.
Average tree age has increased since 1936, but what data lead you to conclude that today's forests are mature or old in general?
Just by the categories that we use. It's a good suggestive question in the sense of what's young, what's old, and you really have a choice of ages or sizes to go with. And looking at the size class distribution, I'd go with that. We didn't really have as good age data on trees in the 36 survey. We did have pretty regular size information. So getting at what that average age was back then, not so clear. But clearly they were, if you wanted to do it on a tree basis, most of them are young. If you want to do it on a volume basis, that would be an older age.
The questioner clarifying said they're not looking at the definition of age classes, but distribution of forest across those classes.
I'm not sure what
They're
that,
not. They said not. They said they're not asking what the definition of the age classes. I think, but the distribution. I'm not sure either.
yeah, the distribution, if you did have age, it would look a lot like the size class distribution. But that's about as far quantitatively as you could go.
Yeah, the hard part with FIA data is we're putting an age on every stand, and it's based on sort of the biggest trees in the stand and what that age is. We've never, there are a lot of mixed age stands, which obviously the whole stand is, every tree in that stand is not that age. Usually we assign the age class to the dominant trees on it. So it's typically the oldest trees, not always.
It's a little...
you might have seed or partial harvest or a few scattered old trees where they base the age class on the regeneration, but then in 10 or 15 years, maybe a 10-year-old stand, you come back and in 10 years you reclass.
acre and can't agree on what that cover type is. Minnesota's forests are very mixed on today's FIA plots. There's about 6 different species on each plot. There are younger trees out there. The classical way to describe that age is the age of the dominant and co-dominant trees. We don't really have much in the way of a classically all-age forest, but we have a forest that has often a number of ages and a number of sizes and a number of species. And that makes it harder here, perhaps than some areas of the country to talk about what's the average age. What's a tree? Is it 1 inch tall or a foot tall or 4.5 feet tall, whatever? So it's a really good question. Pick your metric.
Yeah, forest type by divided by FIA is based on what we see there now. It is not based on what the manager's objectives are. If they planted it to something, but the dominant species is something else, it gets classified as something else. And that can change, the death of one tree or the growth of 2 more trees on the plot can change the cover type from dramatically.
So it's hard when you have to classify the whole landscape. If you just go out and look for what you think are aspen stands, pretty easy, but if you really get into it, you'll find you have, by the classical approach, 15-20% or more of the forest you can't easily classify by your textbook system. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Alan, for your webinar today. And just a couple updates. You should see continuing education credits for those of you that are interested at the end of the webinar. And a couple of updating things. The next webinar series for 2017 is currently being planned. So we don't have a date on the calendar and a topic yet, but expect in both the My Minnesota Woods email and the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative email that we'll announce that here within the next couple of weeks. And another event coming up is the SFEC Research Review. So that's January 10th at Cloquet. And perhaps many of you that are online might be interested in that event as well. So thanks again, Al.
Anybody wants a copy